Hello, welcome back to our series of videos brought to you by NeurMatter, in which we walk you through this project in which you will learn all about topics such as AI, neurological brain disorders, and coding. Today's video is bringing you an introduction to the neurodegenerative disease multiple sclerosis, and we will also talk to you about how we can use mRNA gene data for our project. So let's get into it. Now, from a broad standpoint, multiple sclerosis is a demyelinating autoimmune disorder which attacks the central nervous system of our bodies. Wow, so there's a lot to unpack in this definition. Let's take it apart piece by piece. Alright, so as you probably all know, your body has an organ called the brain. Let's assume this little creature right here is us, right? This little thing is us. We all, hopefully, have something in our body called the brain. Now, as we know, the brain's sole purpose in life is to transmit signals, right? This could be signals to your heart, telling it to start pumping blood. It could be signals to your skin, saying, hey, something is poking me. It could be sending signals to your ear as you listen to this presentation, or, your eyes. Throughout your body, all of your sensory information comes from your brain, as it's transmitting signals, electrical signals, throughout the body. Now, the way the brain does this is through two types of cells. Number one, a neuron. Let's get a picture of that in there. A neuron. Now, most of the types of cells that you see in biology textbooks are, round, circular, very plump looking. This obviously does not look like that. And we'll get into the functionality and the structure of a neuron in a little bit. Now, the second type of cell that most people think about when it comes to the brain is something called a glial cell. Glial cell. Now, in long story short, a glial cell is a type of cell in the brain that's not a neuron. That's basically what it is. We'll get into one specific glial cell a little bit later, but for now, let's talk about the neuron. So right off the bat, we can sort of see how a neuron looks almost nothing like the other cells in the body, right? It's not very round, it's not very plump looking. It doesn't seem to have a lot of organelles, but we can see a few here, like the nucleus, maybe one or two mitochondria, but that's really about it, right? We don't really see a lot of other stuff that is characteristic of other cells. But, we have some structures here. This sort of tree-like forest structure that we see on the outside is something called a dendrite. A dendrite transmits electrical signals from this neuron outward, right? So maybe there's another neuron over here in the distance, right? They're getting those electrical signals. Over on this side is something called the axon terminal that's receiving electrical signals from other neurons. So we can sort of see this sort of chain process. As the electrical signal is passing, through the axon terminal, through the dendrites. But what's really interesting and what we're going to be focusing on throughout this project is something called the axon. Now, this structure right here is called the axon. This sort of middle body of the cell that really looks a little bit freaky. Now, the axon's purpose in life is to transmit the signal throughout the cell in a process called signal propagation. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now, the way this does it is through these little bundles that we see throughout the cell body. The axon is comprised of millions upon millions of these little packages of something called myelin sheath. Let's write that down. Myelin sheath. Now, myelin sheath, long story short, is just a conductive material. In an example that most people like to talk about is something called in electrical wiring. So let's assume that these are wires, right? A bunch of wires that connect to your internet, or that are powering your laptop right now, or any sort of wire, right? We have a tube and a bundle of wires. Now, these wires are carrying electrical signals. They're carrying a lot of information, almost like your neuron. So, similarly, these cells, or these electrical signals, are surrounded by something called an insulator, which helps propagate this electrical signals throughout the wire. Now, the myelin sheath is just that. It's just a conductor and an insulator around an electrical signal. Now, okay, that's great, but where exactly does this myelin actually come from? Where does this conductive material really come from in the body? To answer that question, we need to zoom out a little bit and go back to our glial cells. Now, remember that glial cells are any type of cell in the brain that is not a neuron. One of those types of cells are something called oligodendrocytes. Now, oligodendrocytes, and I know it's a mouthful, but bear with me, an oligodendrocyte is a large cell that connects to the myelin. So it has these little branches that connect to the myelin and really supply the neuron with that conductive material. Now, the oligodendrocyte is responsible for these myelin sheath, which in turn makes it responsible for these conductive electrical signals that happen throughout the brain. Without these oligodendrocytes to supply this conductive material, there would be no electrical transmission, right? What if the rubber companies and the companies that started producing this electrical insulation stopped making that insulation? These signals would be cut short. Similarly, without the conductive material of myelin, the electrical signals in the brain would not be able to function, which would then lead our brain to stop sending these signals, perhaps to the heart or to other important organs in our body. Now, as you can see, multiple sclerosis is a disease that attacks these oligodendrocytes. When it attacks these oligodendrocytes, it renders this myelin sheath useless. And what we just talked about signifies just exactly why multiple sclerosis is as deadly as it is. But there's something that we didn't touch on. Autoimmune disorder. That was the second branch of our lesson today, which we're going to talk about right now. All right, so here as we can see, we have a neuron attached with its oligodendrocyte. Now the oligodendrocyte is supplying much needed myelin to the axon, which is right here, which allows the neuron to propagate signals and electrical signals throughout the brain, right? Going everywhere. So all is well. Now the neuron, oligodendrocytes, glial cells, all of it is stored inside the brain and away from the blood, which is separated by something called the blood-brain barrier, which is sort of like a wall. So we can just draw that right here, a massive wall of really thick cells. Now, over here on this side is the brain, and over here is the blood. And in the middle, of course, is that blood-brain barrier. Now, this blood-brain barrier only lets in a few certain molecules, right? Maybe some nutrients, maybe some tiny cells, but what's really important here is T cells. So let's change our color. All right, so this is our T cell right here. Now, this T cell is part of something called the immune system. Now, I highly encourage you guys to go and learn more about the immune system, as it is a fascinating type of field in our human body. And our videos would be far too long if we tried to explain each level of complexity that came along with the immune system. So I highly encourage you guys to check it out. But all you guys need to know is that our T cells in this certain scenario act as sort of an informer, almost like a detective, just going around making sure that everything is up and okay with our body. So the blood-brain barrier allows these T cells to go inside the brain and check around. So the T cell could be over here, saying, hey, what's up over here? What's good? Is everything seeming okay? Is it working? So in a normal person, these T cells would be bumping around, attaching to the receptors of the axon terminal, and just the neuron in general, and just trying to see if everything's okay. And in a normal person, everything would be okay. But in someone diagnosed with MS or multiple sclerosis, these T cells become hyperactive and they start to release these little chemical signals throughout the brain. Now, these little signals allow the blood-brain barrier to open up. They open up the blood-brain barrier, allowing for more space between the cells. Now, of course, the blood-brain barrier is composed of many thick cells, but when there are a lot of spaces, this allows other cells to get inside. Now, T cells report to their bigger bosses, which are called macrophages. Now, these macrophages, along with B cells, are the big guys. They come inside and really try to eliminate any possible threat, right? They're coming in, they're thinking, oh my God, the T cells are reporting something is wrong. So with these openings, they jump inside in large amounts of numbers. They jump inside like crazy. They're ready to go. They're ready to face off any threat in the body. Now, normally, right, this no, this T cell, this neuron is perfectly healthy. It's attached to its oligodendrocyte. It's getting its myelin. It's propagating its signals. It's totally fine. It's chilling over here. But these T cells in the diseased person are accidentally releasing all of these signals, which force these macrophages to come and actually destroy these connections between the oligodendrocytes and the myelin. This is what's called an autoimmune disorder. An immune disorder is caused when something goes wrong with the T cells and the macrophages, causing the body to harm itself. The auto part comes when the body does this to itself. Normally, some environmental factors or some other stuff could happen to the body, which allows this sort of problem to occur. But now, in this case of MS, the body itself is doing this. These T cells themselves are releasing all of these signals, which are attracting these macrophages to come and destroy the myelin over here. So that is exactly how, on a chemical level, on a very small level, how the body itself is harming itself to get rid of this myelin and get rid of the possibility of the neuron propagating its electrical signals throughout the body. So now let's talk about the last major pillar that when it comes to MS from a biological standpoint. So far we've talked about what exactly is multiple sclerosis and why it's considered an autoimmune disorder, which, as a refresher, is because its own T cells are causing the body to attack it. Now the last major pillar that I want to talk about in this video is where exactly MS attacks. So consider this diagram. The human body, in terms of the nervous system, is comprised of two parts. Number one, we have the central nervous system. And number two, we have, let's do a different color. We have the peripheral nervous system. Now, the central nervous system, let's go back to that green. That central nervous system is comprised of the brain and the spinal cord. Those are the two main parts. All right, so let's say brain, a small picture, and the spinal cord. Those are the two major parts. Now, for the peripheral nervous system, that is everything else. That is all the neurons throughout the body that are connected to the central nervous system. This could be, neurons in your eye, in your feet, in your hands, everywhere else in the body, which are all connected with the signals that are coming from the brain and the spinal cord. Now, given this information, we know that the multiple sclerosis attacks the CNS. So based on this data, if multiple sclerosis is inhibiting these electrical signals, we can then infer and we can realize that these electrical signals are not getting to the peripheral nervous system, which causes stuff like loss of movement, loss of thought, loss of a lot of things that most people would struggle to live without. So that's essentially the last biological pillar that I want to talk about MS, which is where exactly it attacks, which, as we covered, it attacks the central nervous system by, and this is just a quick refresher, by attacking its own myelin sheath by destroying those oligodendrocytes, which are vital to carrying on those electrical signals throughout the neuron. So in terms of the causes of multiple sclerosis, the causes are actually unknown. Now, there has been extensive study into the various possibilities, and the major factors that seem to influence multiple sclerosis the most are environmental and genetic factors. Now, the environmental factors, number one, include infections. Now, an example is a recent study published indicates that mononucleosis, which is sort of an infectious disease that inflames your throat, and it's otherwise known as mono, can actually increase the risk for a person developing multiple sclerosis. Now, that's just one example, but of course a large variety of infections and diseases can play a role in the development of multiple sclerosis. Now, in addition, we also have nutrient deficiency. Specifically, deficiencies in vitamin D, which comes from the sun, have been shown to cause an increased risk. Now, this actually explains why people in the north and south poles of the globe tend to have more multiple sclerosis than those at the equator, which is a very, very interesting data point. Now, the second major factor, and the one that we're going to be focusing most on in this project, is the genetic factor. Now, some genes have to encode for those hyperactive T cells, and we've seen what can happen when those T cells are hyperactive, right? Calling on those macrophages to destroy those oligodendrocytes, which destroys a lot of that myelin, which destroys a lot of those electrical signals, right? And it's a whole mess. Now, after all, these cells don't know what to do in the human body without instructions coming from their genes. So, based on this, we can infer that some type of gene or some type of genetic material is either overexpressed or underexpressed, which leads to this inflammatory response to normal myelin. And how do we look at this difference in expression? By observing mRNA. Alright, so far we have covered a lot about the basic biology of multiple sclerosis and what exactly is happening inside the human brain when that autoimmune disorder strikes and how it can affect a person throughout their life. Now let's dive a little bit deeper and examine what is mRNA's role in this and how we can use mRNA gene data to actually maybe come up with our project and the later steps of our project and really examine RNA and DNA's role in multiple sclerosis as a whole. Now, before we talk about RNA specifically, let's take a broader look and look at DNA. Now, DNA is stored in a cell, right? So let's just draw a cell. This sort of globular looking blob right here is a cell. Let's just call it a cell for cell's sake, right? Now, DNA is actually stored in an organelle inside the cell called a nucleus. When you look at a cell underneath a microscope, you don't really see all the tiny organelles like mitochondria or anything like that. You sort of see this outline and a very dark inner body inside the cell. That is considered a nucleus, and that DNA is stored inside that nucleus. Now, what exactly is DNA? DNA, long story short, is a very, very complex and very, very long molecule that stores genetic instructions. So when you search up pictures of DNA, you might get a little picture like this, with these long double helices on the side and these nitrogenous base pairs in the middle. This is just what DNA is. It's almost like a blueprint for the cell. It tells the cell how to divide, how to grow, how to do everything that a cell would normally do in life. A very common example that people like to give is a house, right? So let's just draw a house here. Now this house needs to be built by a builder. And how does a builder know how to build a house? With its blueprints. So let's just draw some papers over here. These papers are the blueprints. These blueprints tell the builder how to build the house. However, how exactly does a builder take these instructions and actually get the blocks and the paint and the wood for the house? Similarly, how does a cell get all the proteins and all the necessary things it needs to perform its daily tasks, which is instructed to do so by DNA? That is where RNA comes in. Alright, so the first step in the process is something called transcription. In transcription, your cell copies its DNA into something called RNA. So let's see, this is our cell, right? Inside the nucleus are a bunch of DNA strands, right? These little DNA strands. Now, these DNA strands are stored in something called chromosomes, which actually kind of look like what I'm drawing here. But for visual representation, let's just assume that these X's are DNA. So inside the nucleus, if we zoom this out right here, consider this the nucleus. In the nucleus, right, we have a bunch of DNA strands. Now, in transcription, the main process is converting this DNA and making a copy of it into the single-stranded RNA. Now, RNA is just a template. It's an identical copy of one of the strands of DNA that instructs your cell. So we can go back to the blueprint analogy of the builder right here. So let's say the builder who's constructing this house realizes that he's out of bricks and he needs more bricks to construct the house. He wants to send these blueprints, these plans which outline what type of bricks he needs, to the shop. He wants to send them to the factory. But of course he can't send his copy because he still needs to build a house. So what does he do? He goes to the photocopy machine and sends a copy of the blueprint to the builders. This is exactly what happens in transcription. the cell copies its DNA into something called RNA, and RNA is then sent outside of the nucleus, to the second step of the process. All right, so in the second step of the process, this RNA is transferred outside of the nucleus, right, into the cytoplasm where it can be used to create proteins for the cell. In the blueprint analogy, this would be where the blueprints are actually physically sent out to the factory to be made into bricks, right? So if you have our factory here with tons of smoke coming out, right? So the blueprints are actually sent to the brick factory to produce those bricks for the house. Similarly, in the cell, this RNA would be sent out to something called the ribosome. The ribosome, where it would chug out, let's say some smoke here, right? Obviously the ribosome doesn't have smoke, but let's just draw it here. So now this ribosome would be producing things called proteins. Now, how exactly does this RNA get transferred from the nucleus of the cell to the ribosome? This is where something called mRNA comes in, otherwise known as messenger RNA. All right, so what's so special about mRNA and why are we looking at it extensively in our project? Well, we know that mRNA allows the ribosome to create these proteins. And we know that these proteins in multiple sclerosis allow for those T cells, remember those purple structures, to release all of those chemicals which eventually leads to the destruction of those oligodendrocytes. So now going back through the chain, we can see, okay, the T cells are activated by proteins, and these proteins are produced by the ribosome, which is then produced because of this messenger RNA. So if we can take a closer look as to what exactly this mRNA is saying, what levels of gene expression are being shown in this mRNA, we can then use that to see what is wrong with people with MS versus people who are normal, or otherwise known as the control. We can see what levels of gene expression are seen in their mRNA versus control, and we can use that to compare and see which genes specifically are more important towards multiple sclerosis versus others. And that is exactly what we'll be doing in the upcoming videos about gene analysis tools. All right, at last we have got a really intricate understanding of multiple sclerosis. Let's finish it off by having a quick summary of some of the amazing things we talked about today. Number one, we went extensively into the biology behind multiple sclerosis and learned how this is an autoimmune disorder, which is when the body's immune system attacks itself, that prevents the creation of myelin by destroying oligodendrocytes, which are the glial cells that create the insulator myelin. Number two, we deeply looked at genetics and discussed how genes are used to create proteins in cells. More specifically, we looked at how mRNA is used to transfer genetic material from the nucleus to the protein factory ribosome. Given this information, we can use gene expression from the mRNA to see which genes are being used in the factory to create the proteins that may cause multiple sclerosis. Now, keep in mind that these topics are super advanced, and there's a lot of stuff that we did not cover about MS and about genetics, and which we here at NeuroMatter highly recommend you to check out on your own, as the field of biology is absolutely fascinating. Amazing! You have just finished your first video in this course. Congratulations! Over the next few videos, we will go deeper into the field of bioinformatics and use genetic analysis tools to examine our data and get the necessary data to build our neural network. As always, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to email us at neuromatter.org. Thanks and have a great day.